Back in the 1960s, a generation of Westerners was convinced they had found paradise on the rooftop of the world, a place to escape the noise of modern life and find some kind of spiritual truth. Kathmandu, they called its epicenter Freak Street, a haven of cheap living, legal hashish, and what felt like limitless freedom. It was the final mythical stop on a 6,000-mile overland journey from Europe, a destination that promised enlightenment and escape. But here's the thing, this psychedelic dream was built on borrowed time. As the world outside began to change, this Himalayan Shangri-La would come to a sudden dramatic end, leaving behind a legacy that's still debated today. This is the story of the rise and fall of Kathmandu's hippie culture. To get why thousands of young people would travel halfway across the world to a remote Himalayan kingdom, you have to understand the world they were desperate to escape. The 1960s in the West felt like a boiling point, a decade charged with social unrest and sweeping change. A whole generation was growing tired of the stiff conformity and materialism of their parents' world. Between the Vietnam War, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, and a feeling of deep spiritual emptiness, many started looking for answers somewhere else. They were searching for a different way to live, a new kind of truth. And so, the Hippie Trail was born. It was this informal, sprawling overland route stretching from Europe through Turkey and Iran, across the rugged landscapes of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and finally into India and Nepal. Travelers, who often called themselves freaks more than hippies, hit the road in brightly painted vans, crammed into local buses, or just stuck out a thumb, turning their backs on jumbo jets and package tours. This wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. It was, as one historian put it, maybe the first time in history a generation of Westerners traveled not to colonize but to colonize, to learn, not to teach. While plenty of stops along the trail were amazing, Kathmandu was always the final prize. It was whispered about in cafes in Istanbul and hostels in Kabul as a real-life Shangri-La. Part of the appeal was practical. Nepal had only recently opened its borders to foreigners, and while it hadn't abolished visa rules, getting in was incredibly easy. You could get a visa right on arrival. It was also dirt cheap. But the real pull was something way more mystical. Nepal was a land soaked in ancient spiritual traditions, a place where Hinduism and Buddhism lived side by side in a vibrant mix of temples chanting monks and living gods. For a generation obsessed with Eastern philosophy, it felt like plugging into the source. And then there was the most famous or infamous perk. Cannabis wasn't just everywhere and part of the culture, its sale was legal and handled by government licensed shops. This blend of spiritual mystique, jaw-dropping Himalayan scenery, and total freedom from Western rules made Kathmandu the perfect paradise. It was the end of the road. As that trickle of travelers turned into a flood, they all converged on one place, a narrow street called Chochintole. The locals took one look at the new arrivals and gave it a name that stuck, Freak Street. This little lane quickly became the global capital of the counterculture, a Himalayan Haight-Ashbury where East and West smashed together in a vibrant, chaotic and creative explosion. Life on Freak Street was a universe away from the manicured lawns of suburban America or the grey streets of industrial Europe. The air was thick with incense, spices, and the sweet earthy smell of hashish. Psychedelic rock and Bob Dylan protest songs blasted from cafes, mixing with the sound of temple bells. Guest houses offered rooms for just pennies a night, and restaurants got with the program. Savvy Nepali business owners quickly realized their new clientele had specific appetites. Soon you could find apple pie and chocolate cake served right alongside traditional dal bhat, a genius move to cater to the munchies. One of those places, the Snowman Cafe, is still there today, a time capsule from 1965. A totally unique culture started to emerge. Hippie fashion, all flowing cotton and tie-dye, blended with local Tibetan jewelry and Nepali textiles, creating a style that eventually made its way back west. Local musicians started experimenting, mixing the sounds of the sitar with folk and rock. But this wasn't a one-way street. Plenty of young Nepalese were drawn into the Freak Street lifestyle. Their own lives changed forever by the encounter. For a short, brilliant time, Freak Street was a melting pot of art, ideas, and spirituality, even attracting celebrities who came to soak it all in. The Nepalese government was initially on board, enjoying the economic boost. They even ran direct bus routes from the airport straight to Freak Street, dropping the freaks right into their ready-made haven. But the local reaction was complicated. While business owners welcomed the money, many in Nepal's more conservative society were less than thrilled with the rampant drug use and what they saw as a complete lack of morals. Still, for those in the thick of it, it was a golden age. They truly believed they had built a utopia. They had found their paradise. But as the 60s turned into the 70s, the outside world was already plotting to bring it all crashing down. But a dream like this could never last. The bubble around Freak Street was about to be burst by the force of global politics. It all started in Washington, D.C. In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared his infamous war on drugs, calling drug abuse public enemy number one. And this wasn't just a domestic policy, it was a global crusade with Nepal squarely in its crosshairs. To the Nixon administration, the freewheeling paradise of Kathmandu, with its government-licensed hash shops, was an embarrassment. The pressure mounted. In 1973, US Vice President Spiro Agnew paid a visit to Kathmandu and made the message crystal clear: crack down on drugs or say goodbye to American financial aid. For a small developing nation like Nepal, that was a threat it couldn't ignore. The Nepalese government folded. Just months later, Nepal passed its first ever anti-drug laws, a complete reversal of centuries of tradition. The government shut down all the legal hashish shops on Freak Street. Suddenly, strict rules on appearance were enforced for tourists. Police began rounding up hippies, with many being deported. The message from the US was clear: the party was over. Soon, the influence of American anti-drug policy was felt on the ground, with rumors of surveillance targeting Westerners and marking them for arrest back home. The crackdown's impact went far beyond the hippie community. In rural Nepal, tens of thousands of farmers depended on cannabis cultivation for their livelihood. When the government burned their fields, it pushed whole communities toward starvation. That economic desperation didn't directly the country's future conflicts, but it certainly poured fuel on the fire, creating deep-seated local grievances that would be exploited years later during the violent Maoist insurgency. At the exact same time the Hippie Trail itself was dying, the overland journey became a geopolitical minefield. First, the 1979 Iranian Revolution slammed one door shut, and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan locked another. The magic carpet ride was over. There was no road to Kathmandu anymore. The story of Freak Street is one of those fascinating forgotten corners of history. If you love digging into stories like this, make sure you subscribe and join our community of explorers. The hippies left, their visas were cancelled, and the party was over. Nepal deliberately rebranded its tourism industry, shifting focus from the counterculture to more respectable adventures like organized trekking and mountaineering. The center of tourist life moved from the narrow alleys of Freak Street to the newer, more commercial neighborhood of Tamil. But you can't just erase a legacy like that. Walk down that same street today, Chochentole and the echoes of the 60s are still there if you know where to look. It's quieter now. Some of the old pie shops and guest houses remain, their insides like dusty time capsules. Shops still hawk tie-dye shirts and singing bowls, commercialized relics of a movement that once preached anti-materialism. Freak Street is a living monument to a time when a revolution in consciousness briefly merged with ancient tradition. So what's the real legacy here? It's a paradox. For all their flaws and naivete, the hippies were the ones who really put Nepal on the modern map. They came looking for enlightenment in the Himalayas, and in the process, they helped create the global image of Nepal as a center for mysticism and adventure, an identity that still draws travelers to this very day. The paradise they were looking for was fleeting, a psychedelic dream that crashed into a harsh political reality. But the story of Freak Street is a powerful reminder of a time when a generation truly believed they could find heaven on earth at the top of the world in the winding streets of Kathmandu.